He had faced down enemy fire, led daring missions through war-torn jungles, and carried his wounded brothers to safety. But on the day Colonel Hal Carter nearly lost his life, the battlefield wasn't some distant, foreign soil. It was a quiet hospital lobby in his own country, a place where his uniform meant nothing and his service was invisible. This is not just the story of a veteran. It's the story of a father gasping for breath while paperwork came before care. It's the story of a daughter, Angela, whose love turned into fury as she watched the strongest man she knew crumble, ignored, dismissed, and misjudged. And it's the story of a storm, both literal and human-made, that tested the meaning of duty in America. What unfolded next wasn't just a rescue, it was a reckoning, one that would expose deep cracks in a broken system and remind a nation of the price of silence. Hal Carter had always stood for others. And on the night everything fell apart, an army of strangers rose to stand for him. Let me take you back to the moment it all began. The storm roared with a fury that made it feel as though nature itself was conspiring to keep him from leaving. Sheets of rain slashed against the hospital windows. The wind howled like a beast in pain, and above it all, the steady thunder of a Black Hawk helicopter descending pierced through the chaos. The aircraft's rotors battered the air with such force that the hospital walls trembled under the pressure. Inside the ER, Colonel Hal Carter lay on a gurney, his body barely clinging to life. For hours he had been neglected, overlooked in a crowded, understaffed facility. And now the end loomed close. His breathing was faint and uneven. His lips quivered with the effort it took to speak. His daughter leaned over him, her face wet with tears, her hands gripping his as if her love alone could anchor him to the world. With the last scrap of strength in him, Hal rasped, "Please don't let me die here." Her eyes locked with his, a silent vow forming between them in that moment of desperation. Then came the sound of boots, soldiers bursting through the doors, defying the chain of command. Without waiting for protocol or permission, they swept into action. They lifted Hal carefully but urgently, pushing through hallways slick with water, up staircases lit by emergency lights, their uniforms soaked from the storm. Above, the Black Hawk hovered just above the hospital's rooftop, its spotlight carving a path through the blackness. Its presence was a beacon of defiance against time, bureaucracy, and fate. What unfolded next wouldn't just save a life, it would spark a reckoning that would bind strangers, uncover systemic failures, and ripple through the nation in ways no one could foresee. Colonel Harold Hal Carter had never needed to raise his voice to be heard. He didn't posture or demand attention. He earned it quietly, with a presence that spoke of battles fought and lives changed. At 69, time had softened his frame. The sharp lines of his youth had faded, and his back bore a subtle stoop, the legacy of years under a rucksack and the wear of old wounds. Still, when Hal walked the streets of his hometown in Alabama, people noticed. The old-timers would tip their hats, offering a respectful "Morning, Colonel," and the younger folks, even if they didn't know all the details, recognized they were in the company of someone who mattered. Hal had poured nearly his entire life into serving the United States Army. He was barely out of his teens when he first set foot in the jungles of Vietnam, green, determined, and already tempered by quiet grit. Later, he would distinguish himself during the Gulf War, leading men through chaos and fire with the calm resolve of someone who knew both fear and how to master it. His military career was filled with stories that most wouldn't speak of, let alone survive. There were missions deep in enemy territory, rescue operations carried out under relentless fire, desperate pushes to save downed pilots or encircled units. Hal had a rule: no man left behind, and he lived it again and again. There were generals walking around today who owed their lives to Hal Carter. He, however, never once brought it up. He didn't chase medals or attention. He let his service speak through action, not words. His body bore the scars of that service. A shard of shrapnel lodged dangerously near his spine had become a permanent fixture, too risky to remove, causing a low-grade pain that never truly left him. His left hand, once steady enough to perform precision field work under fire, now lacked its former strength, the tendons torn years ago when he dragged a fellow soldier from the wreckage of a burning vehicle. But Hal didn't complain. He adjusted. He kept going. His sense of dignity wasn't something he wore. It was built into the way he moved through the world. Quietly, steadily, with a kind of grace most people didn't notice until they needed someone to lean on. In his hometown, people saw him not just as a soldier, but as a man of quiet decency. He could be spotted in his garden on most mornings, coaxing tomatoes from the sun-baked Alabama soil, or pausing to help a neighbor's kid fix a busted bike chain. He never waited to be asked. If a widow struggled with groceries, Hal would be there before she even turned around. That was the kind of man he was. And that's exactly where he was the day it all began. Kneeling in his garden as dawn broke, the air already thick with southern humidity. He was trimming back his tomato plants, running his fingers through the soil with practiced ease, grounded by the simple pleasure of tending to something living. The first hint of discomfort was so mild he barely noticed. A small twinge in his chest, easy to dismiss after a lifetime of enduring worse. But as he stood, brushing dirt from his pants, the pain deepened. A dull throb at first, then a slow tightening, like a steel band wrapping around his ribcage. Hal had been through worse, he told himself. But this was different. This didn't pass. Men in his situation might have called for help, reached for a phone, admitted they couldn't go it alone. But not Hal. Never Hal. Stubborn to the bone, just as his late wife used to say. Always with a smile, always with a softness in her voice that made the word feel like a compliment. He wiped a sheen of sweat from his forehead, his fingers trembling slightly, then took up his keys and slid into the driver's seat of his aging pickup. Trouble might be waiting for him, but Hal Carter didn't back down from trouble. If something was wrong, he'd face it the only way he knew how. Head on. He steered the truck toward the local hospital, the tires crunching over gravel, unaware that this seemingly simple decision, this small act of self-preservation, was about to set off a chain of events that would challenge more than just his body. It would press against the conscience of an entire nation. The automatic doors at Westwood Regional Medical Center parted with a soft hiss, and Colonel Harold Hal Carter stepped into the chill lobby. The blast of cold, conditioned air struck his face like a slap, so stark against the wet, suffocating humidity of the Alabama morning that he had to brace himself against the wall. A dizzy wave rolled over him, powerful and sudden, leaving him momentarily unmoored. His heart beat furiously, too fast, too uneven. It wasn't the firm, predictable thump of exertion. No, this was chaos beneath his ribs, something dark and foreign that didn't belong. Still, he kept moving forward, one slow, dragging boot step at a time, toward the reception desk. The floor was polished to a hospital shine, and his worn soles scuffed against it with every step. In his hand, he clutched his military ID with a grip that trembled more than he cared to admit. That plastic card, once his ticket into secure rooms, once the symbol of authority and respect in battlefields across the globe, he held it now like it might still open a door, or at the very least, earn him a little urgency. Behind the desk sat a young woman, barely out of high school by the looks of her. 19? Maybe 20. Her name tag read Emily, the letters surrounded by tiny glittery stickers like something from a child's craft kit. She didn't look up, just flipped between screens, social media in one tab, the hospital's registration system in the other. I need to see a doctor, Hal said, trying to steady his voice, though his chest felt like it was caving in from the inside. Pain, pressure, something was terribly wrong. Chest pain, I've had heart issues before. Emily didn't react, didn't even blink. She slid a clipboard toward him, her eyes still fixed on the monitor. You'll need to fill this out, she said flatly, and have a seat. We'll call you. Hal stared at the form for a beat too long, his vision blurred at the edges, darkening into shadows that pulsed with each irregular beat of his heart. He braced himself again against the counter, his knuckles brushing cold laminate. Then, as calmly as he could, he placed his military ID and VA card beside the clipboard. Please, he said, voice lower now, thick with something between urgency and desperation. This is urgent. Finally, Emily looked up. A flicker of irritation creased her brow, like he'd interrupted something important. Sir, she said with a practiced edge, I can't move you ahead of other patients. We're really busy today. Her eyes slid past him, already disengaging, already moving on. Behind him, a young man laughed and clutched an ice pack to his wrist, his buddy beside him making some joke that echoed off the sterile walls. Hal turned, shoulders sagging beneath an invisible weight, and shuffled over to the chairs lining the far side of the waiting room. His pride felt dented, bruised, hollow in his chest like something essential had cracked loose. He eased himself down into the hard plastic seat. Around him, time crawled. One by one, the names of other patients filled the air. Never his. A teenager limped in with a sprained ankle. She was seen. A woman with nothing more than a stress headache. She was seen. Each name called that wasn't his twisted the tight knot in his chest just a little tighter. There was a brutal irony in it. That name, Colonel Harold Carter, had once carried weight. It had once opened secured gates, calmed panicked troops, summoned helicopters in the dead of night. Now, here, it meant nothing. Just another old man in a hospital chair. Hal Carter had bled for this country, had led men into firefights and come back with fewer than he'd left with. He'd stood between danger and safety more times than he could count. But here, in this sanitized, fluorescent-lit waiting room, he was invisible. Just another patient. Just another problem. His forehead glistened with fresh sweat, despite the room's artificial chill. His breath came shallow now, lips parting slightly as he fought to keep it steady. One hand clutched the armrest, his knuckles bone-white with the effort of holding on. No one noticed. No one came. No one cared. Angela Carter's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, her knuckles had gone white. The world outside her windshield blurred into smears of gray and headlights. But inside her mind, everything was crystal clear and screaming. Just 10 minutes earlier, her phone had buzzed with a call that changed everything. It was her father, Colonel Hal Carter. His voice had come through faint, rasping, and so unlike the man she knew. The man who taught her how to stand her ground, how to be unshakable. "I'm at the hospital, sweetheart. Don't worry. Just a little chest pain." But Angela had heard it, the way his breath caught, the way fatigue weighed down every word. She knew. Panic had risen in her throat like fire, but she pushed it back with practiced control. Her father hadn't raised her to fall apart. By the time she burst through the hospital's sliding glass doors, her heart was pounding louder than the storm in her chest. Then she saw him. Colonel Hal Carter, her hero, her father, slouched in a plastic chair in the ER waiting room. His face was drained of color. His shirt clung to him, soaked with sweat. He looked so small in that moment, like the life had been quietly leaking out of him as the world moved on around him. Nurses chatted softly behind the desk. A security guard sat in the corner scrolling through his phone. Patients were called, one by one, through double doors that led deeper into the emergency wing. But no one, not one person, was paying attention to the man slumped alone in the corner. "Daddy!" Angela gasped, running to him, dropping to her knees by his side. Hal turned toward her, trying to smile. It was weak, meant to comfort her like always, but it broke her instead. His smile didn't reach his eyes. His skin was damp and cold under her fingers. She pressed her hand against his chest, trying to feel his heartbeat. It fluttered fast and shallow, like a trapped bird trying to escape. Angela stood up, fury boiling to the surface. She stormed to the front desk, where a young woman lazily chewed gum and tapped at a keyboard without once glancing up. "My father is having a heart attack," Angela said, her voice sharp, urgent. "He's been sitting there like that. How long? How long has he been "Ma'am," the receptionist said flatly, not looking at her, "I need you to calm down." Calm down. Suddenly, Angela wasn't 35 anymore. She was 6, sitting on the wooden porch steps, barefoot in the summer heat, listening to her father's voice. "Being strong doesn't mean being loud, honey. It means using what you've got to help people. We look out for each other. That's what makes a good soldier and a good person." She remembered how he'd mow the neighbor's lawn after a long shift, how he never hesitated to stop and help a stranger on the side of the road. Her father had spent a lifetime giving to others, quietly, faithfully, never asking for anything in return. And now here he was, alone, overlooked, forgotten. Angela's hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. Her thumb hovered over the record button. If they weren't going to help because it was the right thing to do, then maybe they'd help because the world was watching. She hit record, captured it all, the receptionist's indifference, the soft beeping in the background, her father's shallow, strained breaths. This wasn't just about Hal Carter anymore. This was about every veteran, every father, every man who had been forgotten when it mattered most. Then it happened. One moment, her father was upright, barely, holding onto her hand with what little strength he had left. The next, his entire body seemed to collapse inward. His knees gave out. His head fell forward. "Daddy!" Angela screamed, lunging forward, catching him before he hit the floor. She eased him down onto the cold tile, cradling his head, brushing back the wet hair from his forehead. His chest moved, barely. Shallow rises, shallow falls. And still, no one had come. His breath came in uneven, shallow gasps. The face Angela had always seen as the very embodiment of strength, firm, calm, a steady presence throughout her life, was now contorted in pain, the edges of his lips tinged a frightening blue. Her voice cracked under the weight of panic as she screamed, "Somebody help us!" It wasn't just fear that gripped her. It was the helplessness, the disbelief that no one was rushing to her father's side. What happened next would etch itself into her memory, not just for the terror of watching her father suffer, but for the cold indifference of those who were supposed to help. Two staff members finally appeared. The first was a nurse, probably in her late 40s, who gave Hal one glance, just one, and frowned like he was more of a problem than a patient. The second was a security guard, tall, thick-chested, and standing like he was ready for a fight, not a medical emergency. The shine of his badge looked out of place, almost mocking. He looked at Hal the way you'd look at someone loitering in the wrong place, not a man fighting for his life. "Ma'am," the nurse began, already bristling with suspicion, "has your father been drinking today? Taken anything?" Angela's jaw dropped. "What? No, he's having a heart attack. Look at him." Her voice wavered, shaking with disbelief. The nurse folded her arms, unmoved. "I'm just saying it's not unusual for folks to come in here looking for pain meds. We can't just—" "Are you serious right now?" Angela's voice rose, sharp with outrage. Her body trembled as the fury poured out. "He's a decorated veteran. He's never taken anything in his life since Kai, unless a doctor told him to. He needs help." The guard shifted his stance, taking a slow step forward. One hand hovered near his radio. "Ma'am, we don't want a disturbance. We'll get to him when we can. You need to calm down." Angela stared in disbelief. It was revolting, absolutely sickening. But it wasn't rare. Not for people like her father. Not in this country. She'd read the stories, seen the headlines. Veterans left to wait, ignored or assumed to be drug-seeking or exaggerating. Especially if they were older, if they were poor, or if they didn't look like someone worth saving. Seconds mattered. Lives slipped away in those seconds. And now her father, Hal Carter, who once braved bullets to drag wounded men from burning vehicles, who led his unit through hell and back, was being treated like a burden, a nuisance, a liar, all because of prejudice, because they couldn't or wouldn't see past their own biases. Angela dropped to her knees beside him. Her tears fell freely now, soaking her cheeks and the front of her shirt. She didn't stop her phone from recording. Every word, every cold accusation, every second of shameful inaction. Her father's eyes fluttered weakly. His chest rose and fell with rattling, fragile breaths. She thought about all the times he'd jumped into danger without hesitation, about all the lives he'd saved. And now no one was coming for him. No doctors, no nurses, no urgency, only judgment. "I'll make the calls myself," she whispered fiercely, gently brushing sweat-damp strands of hair from his forehead. "Hold on, Daddy. I'm not letting them take you from me." The staff walked away, indifferent, unbothered, their backs turned. But Angela's heart hardened. This wasn't going to be the end. If they wouldn't fight for her father, she would move heaven and earth on her own. With trembling fingers, she unlocked her phone. The screen was slick from her tears, her hands shaky as she scrolled past names, coworkers, neighbors, classmates, until one name made her pause. Peter Dawson. General Peter Dawson. Retired now, but once her father's most trusted friend and fellow soldier. She could still picture him at their old backyard cookouts, tall and warm, joking with her dad like they were blood brothers rather than men who saluted each other, always calling him brother, never sir. If anyone would understand the kind of man Hal Carter was, if anyone still had the power to cut through the red tape and force someone to care, it was Peter. She didn't hesitate. If there was one person who could change this, it was him. Her thumb slammed the call button, and she pressed the phone tight to her ear, stealing a glance at her father lying pale and barely breathing on the hospital bed. His breath came in uneven, shallow gasps, and his skin had taken on a grayish hue that made her stomach turn. With every unanswered ring, the anxiety knotted tighter in her chest. At last, the call connected. A voice broke through, deep and commanding, steady as ever. No, unchanged by time. Angela! Her throat tightened at the sound. General Dawson, her voice cracked. It's my dad. Hal, he's at Westwood Regional. Something's wrong. They're saying he's faking it, that he's drug-seeking. They're not helping him, sir. He's dying, please. I didn't know who else to call. There was a beat of silence, but it wasn't hesitation. It was something else, a shift. The calm calculation of a man who had been trained to act under fire. When he spoke again, his tone had hardened, sharp and decisive, stripping away every trace of civilian life. Stay with him, Dawson ordered. Don't leave his side. I'm making calls. Then the line cut out. Angela stared at her phone for a second, stunned, but for the first time in what felt like hours, maybe days, she didn't feel abandoned. She wasn't fighting this alone anymore. Thousands of miles away, in a dimly lit study adorned with war memorabilia, battlefield photographs, and the crisp folds of retired American flags, Peter Dawson was already on his feet. The phone was back in his hand before the silence could settle. His mind snapped into motion like it had during every high-stakes mission. No room for outrage, no time for disbelief, just pure, focused execution. The first call was to a colonel he'd once taken under his wing, now stationed at a military base not far from the hospital. The next to a former aide working in a powerful veterans advocacy group in D.C. Then another to a journalist with national clout, a war correspondent who had embedded with Hal Carter's unit during the Gulf War. A man who owed Hal his life after being dragged out of a kill zone under heavy fire. This story doesn't die in that hospital, Dawson told him. Spread the word. Get eyes on Westwood. Hal Carter needs backup. And with that, the signal went out. It wasn't loud, but it was immediate. An invisible web of loyalty and duty lit up. Emails surged through inboxes. Encrypted group chats lit up. Direct lines buzzed in the hands of people who didn't hesitate when the name Hal Carter came up. From retired brass at the Pentagon to junior officers still in the field. From veterans organizations to media contacts who remembered Hal as more than just another uniform, word moved like wildfire. At Fort Blake, barely 50 miles from Westwood Regional, Lieutenant General Sam Whitaker hung up with Dawson and turned with purpose. Get me a flight status on our bird, he snapped to his ops officer. The officer hesitated. Sir, if we prep for a medevac, that's a priority 1 flight, but it's not official. We don't have the paperwork. Whitaker met him with a look that cut through protocol like a blade. Then it's not official. Hal Carter pulled half my damn platoon out of a kill box in Kuwait. I'll be damned if I let him die because of some admin rubber stamp. Get it done. Back inside Westwood Regional, the walls still echoed with that same cold silence. Staff passed by with mechanical disinterest, offering nothing more than skeptical glances. But something had shifted. Angela didn't know how or why yet, but she felt it, heard it. A sound cut through the storm outside, low at first, then louder. The rhythmic, steady whump-whump of rotor blades slicing through air and rain. The cavalry was coming. Not because protocol had been followed, not because the hospital suddenly remembered its oath, but because Hal Carter's life of service had created something greater than protocol. It had forged an unbreakable bond of brothers and sisters who would not let him fall. Outside, the storm had grown monstrous. It wasn't just rain now, it was a fury. Winds slammed into the building with hurricane force. Rain pelted the roof in horizontal sheets. Lightning flashed like artillery bursts overhead, and debris skittered like shrapnel across the helipad. The storm howled and raged as if the very elements wanted to hold Hal Carter hostage, to drag him under before help could reach him. But help was coming anyway. The power sputtered, flickering like a dying candle against the storm's wrath. And down in the waiting room, both patients and staff stood frozen, peering anxiously through the rain-streaked windows. Darkness had swallowed everything outside, flooded the sky, swallowed the roads, and none of them truly knew what was approaching. Then, breaking through the thick black veil, came a sound so steady, so deliberate, it seemed like the heartbeat of something sacred. Low, rhythmic thumps echoing through the night, unwavering even against the roar of wind and thunder. It was the rotors, the unmistakable hum of a Black Hawk helicopter tearing through the tempest, growing louder with every second until the sound filled the air like a promise. Its powerful searchlights burst through the deluge, slicing across the rooftop in jagged strokes of white, illuminating the chaos with brief flashes of controlled intensity. The Black Hawk emerged from the storm like something summoned, not by command, but by need, by will, by something deeper than mere duty. Rain slammed against its frame, winds clawed at its sides, but the aircraft held steady, defiant in the storm's grip. The downdraft from the rotors turned the rooftop into its own storm zone. Rain whipped into spirals. Bushes flattened, unsecured papers flew like panicked birds through open emergency doors. And yet the Black Hawk hovered, steady, immovable, an emblem of resolve in nature's fury. At the controls sat Captain Maria Vasquez, her face set with razor-sharp focus. Jaw clenched, eyes narrowed. She locked onto the helipad below with the unwavering precision of a soldier who had danced with death and learned to lead. Her hands moved fluidly over the controls, every motion a product of years spent in combat zones where hesitation cost lives. The storm hurled everything at her, crosswinds that yanked at the tail, gusts that tried to twist her off course. But she absorbed each blow with the quiet mastery of someone who refused to lose anyone on her watch. On the rain-slicked rooftop, soldiers and medics waited, boots slipping as they braced against the elements, every movement deliberate and trained. They signaled the pilot with practiced choreography, their soaked uniforms clinging to them, their faces set in concentration. Drenched but undeterred, they moved as one, resolute, unshaken. Inside the hospital, administrators panicked, waving clipboards like flags, shouting about regulations and safety codes, policies and chains of command. But their words were lost to the thunder of blades overhead. No one heard them. No one cared. In that moment, rank wasn't defined by desk titles or paperwork. It was defined by heart, by those willing to act when it counted. Rules were bent. Orders were ignored. Nurses slipped away from their stations, rushing toward the roof with quiet determination. Medics had one singular mission: get Hal Carter to safety. Every other concern faded beneath that goal. When the Black Hawk finally descended, it didn't crash or drop. It arrived with exacting control, its skids kissing the concrete with the finesse of practiced professionals. The moment it touched down, the team sprang into motion. The stretcher came forward, guided by firm hands, as medics worked swiftly, securing straps, checking vitals, shielding Hal's fragile frame from the storm that seemed to want to tear him away. At the edge of the helipad stood Angela, her face drenched in rain and emotion. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching as the man who had once shown her what courage looked like was now surrounded by a new generation living it. Every soul on that rooftop had chosen to be there. Not for orders, not for recognition, but because Hal Carter had once stood for them. Now they stood for him. This wasn't just a rescue, it was a vow, a defiant reminder that loyalty formed in the fire of battle doesn't dissolve with time or uniform. It lasts, it endures, it answers the call. Where red tape had faltered, honor had not. And as the Black Hawk lifted into the sky once more, rising into the churning heart of the storm, it carried more than a man on a stretcher. It carried proof that in a world of chaos there are still those who choose courage, still those who believe in something greater. Above the thunder and through the rain, the sound of the rotors beat louder, unyielding, resolute, unstoppable. Honor rose with the Black Hawk into the night, swirled somewhere between consciousness and the dark pull of oblivion. The noise, the pain, the chaos, it all drifted in and out like a radio struggling to find a signal. He was aware of movement, of the cold bite of air against his skin, of hands working frantically over his body. But the details blurred. Time lost all meaning. Somewhere deep inside, a voice called out to him, distant but familiar. A memory? A dream? He tried to hold on to it, to fight through the fog that threatened to pull him under. But every breath was a mountain to climb. Every beat of his heart, a fading drum in a faraway parade. Faces came and went. Maria's, Miller's, others he couldn't name, flashing across his thoughts like ghosts in a mirror. Then came the surge of pain, bright and scorching, dragging him back to the now. His body arched slightly against the restraints, a guttural sound catching in his throat. "Come on, Colonel, that's it. Stay with me," Miller shouted again, his voice hoarse from shouting against the storm. Sweat and rainwater ran in rivulets down his face, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The vitals dipped again, and Miller's gloved hand darted for another syringe. The second medic, braced against the jerking motion of the chopper, held fast, offering a nod of support through clenched teeth. Their training was second nature now, but the stakes tonight felt different, like something greater was looming just outside the fuselage. Vasquez gritted her teeth, scanning her instruments through the chaos. Warnings blinked like angry eyes. Altitude, wind shear, turbulence. She adjusted her grip, muscles trembling with effort. "Hold together," she muttered to the machine, to herself, to fate. Just a little longer. The storm slammed into them again, harder this time, like a blow from a giant's fist. The entire Black Hawk dipped and groaned, one skid catching a stream of wind that tilted them dangerously to the side. The medical team held on, shielding the equipment and the gurney with their bodies. Vasquez cursed under her breath and adjusted, fighting for balance, coaxing the bird back into alignment with sheer grit and skill. A flash of lightning split the sky, too close, too bright, and for an instant everything was illuminated. Hal's eyes fluttered open, just barely. He wasn't seeing clearly, not really, but something in him stirred. A breath, a spark, a memory of why he had to survive. "Talk to me, Hal," Miller urged, his hand now gripping Hal's shoulder. "You've come through worse than this. You don't get to quit now." Hal's lips moved behind the oxygen mask. No words came, only a whisper of air. But it was something. And in the midst of the storm, in the mall-shaking, defiant world of that Black Hawk cabin, it was everything. They weren't out of danger. Not even close. But Hal was still alive. The bird was still flying. And as long as that was true, they hadn't lost. Not yet. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his brain starved of oxygen, reality unraveling as memories flooded in, tangled and raw. In his mind, time rewound. He was young again, skin raw with sand and grime, the desert air choked with smoke and gunpowder. It was the night of the ambush, seared into his soul with relentless clarity. The chaos, the noise, the terror, he remembered it all. Ellis, barely more than a boy, lay gut-shot beside him, his life spilling out in hot, pulsing waves onto Hal's hands. Hal had dropped to his knees, pressing makeshift bandages against the wound, his voice trembling but steady as he whispered promises, refusing to abandon him, vowing help was near. Now, decades later, it was Hal who was fading. His lungs fought for air, his heart stumbling, and this time it was strangers who surrounded him, men and women who hadn't even been born when he had carried Ellis through that hellfire. Yet here they were, fighting for his life with the same unwavering resolve he had once shown without hesitation. In his fogged and battered mind, he saw it, reflections of loyalty, of duty mirrored through time. Honor passed from one generation to the next. "We're losing him!" Miller's voice tore through the haze, sharp and urgent. Thready sprang into action, snatching the defibrillator paddles and locking eyes with his partner. "Clear!" The jolt slammed through Hal's body just as the Black Hawk heaved sideways, battered by the storm's final desperate assault. Rain and wind screamed around them, as though nature itself was determined to claim him. Then came the shriek, A piercing, soul-stopping flatline on the monitor. It stretched on, impossibly long, then stuttered, wavered, fought its way back into rhythm. Weak, fragile, but alive. 10 minutes out, Vasquez's voice cracked through the comms, breath tight but focused. Hold him. And they did. Not just with wires and adrenaline, not just with machines and medicine, but with something deeper. With sheer willpower, with a strength born in the same crucible Hal had once led them through. The storm could thrash, the night could roar, but they weren't letting go. Not now, not like this. No wind, no weather, no cruelty of fate was going to steal Hal Carter from this world without a fight. The storm was still raging when the Black Hawk finally dropped onto the landing pad at the Military Medical Center. But by then, the battleground had shifted from the air to the sterile, bright corridors of the hospital. Hal was wheeled in fast, the surgical team already scrubbed in and waiting, their movements sharp, decisive. Vasquez had alerted them mid-flight. They'd been ready. The surgeons fought hard, a coordinated battle against a heart on the verge of surrender. Hours slipped by in a blur of relentless effort. When the morning finally broke, drenched in rain and streaked with exhausted light, Colonel Hal Carter was still alive, but only just. Later, the cardiac surgeon would speak quietly to Angela, Hal's closest and fiercest advocate. 10 more minutes, he said, voice grave. Maybe less, and we wouldn't be having this conversation. Hal had made it, but the cost was steep. His recovery would be long. His body would never quite be the same. And the night he nearly died, abandoned, dismissed, overlooked, had etched itself into the very fabric of who he was. Angela never left his side. Through the long hours of surgery, through the agonizing wait, through every beep and breath in uncertain silence, she stayed. And when Hal finally blinked open his eyes in the recovery room, dazed but aware, she broke down. Relief crashed over her in a wave, but it wasn't soft. It burned. Because by then, the truth was out. Angela had posted the videos. Her hands had trembled as she uploaded the footage from the waiting room. The front desk clerk's cold indifference, the staff's callous accusations, the outright dismissal of a man in agony, a decorated veteran seen as an inconvenience, or worse. She hadn't known if it would matter. She hadn't even known if Hal would survive long enough for it to matter. But she had done it anyway, and it had mattered. It had mattered a lot. Within hours, the footage exploded across the internet. Veterans groups shared it first, angry, grieving, furious. Then came the news outlets, then everyone. The sight of Hal, weak, suffering, ignored, spread like wildfire. Carter, ashen, wheezing on the verge of collapse, had been dismissed like a nobody. That gut-wrenching image, broadcast across screens nationwide, didn't just spark anger. It unleashed a fury that refused to be contained by party lines, state borders, or generational divides. News outlets couldn't get enough. Primetime commentary programs rolled out entire segments under banners like, "How could this happen to a hero?" Operations analysts publicly condemned it as a national disgrace. Even late-night talk shows, usually places of levity and satire, pressed pause on the jokes. For once, they offered something different. Somber, heartfelt tributes to Hal Carter. The soldier left gasping in a hospital hallway, neglected when he needed help most. But media outrage was only the beginning. The real reckoning began when Capitol Hill turned its eyes toward the story. Congressional hearings were summoned with uncommon speed. Angela received a formal request to testify. So did the doctors. So did the soldiers involved in the harrowing helicopter rescue. Inside the marble halls of power, screens flickered with storm-swept footage of the Black Hawk descending through rain and chaos to save Hal's life. His medical records, undeniable proof that he was within minutes of death when they found him, were submitted into the official record. Veterans, many with prosthetic limbs, service dogs, and medals pinned to their jackets, packed the corridors of Congress on the day Angela testified. Some came in wheelchairs, some limped on canes. All of them came because Hal's story was their story, a mirror held up to a system they knew too well. And from that thunderstorm of voices, something long overdue began to take shape. Change didn't come in a neat package, and it didn't come without resistance. But it came, hard-won, imperfect, but real. A sweeping new law passed, one that fortified emergency protections for veterans. It was now mandated that no veteran in crisis could be denied urgent medical care because of bureaucratic red tape, mistaken assumptions, or latent prejudice. Any hospital receiving federal funds would be held legally accountable, criminally liable, if its staff obstructed that duty. Hal Carter's near-death experience ignited reforms that would go on to save untold lives. A man who had once pulled wounded soldiers to safety in the heat of battle, who had survived bullets and explosions far from home, ended up rescuing countless others in his most defenseless hour. And in his usual humble fashion, Hal said little when asked how he felt. "I just hope it helps someone else's son," he replied softly. "Someone else's dad." Exactly 1 year later, under a sky so vividly clear, it felt like the heavens themselves had cleared the clouds in tribute, Westwood stood still. The storm, once so fierce, was now only a memory, but its impact was etched into the landscape and into the hearts of those gathered to remember. A crowd assembled, made up of veterans, lawmakers, hospital staff, and everyday citizens whose lives had been touched by Hal's story. They stood in reverent silence as Colonel Harold Hal Carter, now retired, sat proudly in his wheelchair. He wore a crisp navy blazer, service ribbons aligned with quiet dignity on his chest. His hands, still recovering from that brutal night, rested gently on the chair's arms. But when he began to speak, his voice was steady, and within it pulsed the calm strength of a man who had faced death and come back not bitter, but resolute. Behind him stood the newly dedicated emergency care wing, a sleek building of steel and shimmering glass that caught the morning light like a beacon. Above its double doors, carved into the pale stone for all time, were the words, "The Colonel Harold Carter Veteran Emergency Center." Hal lifted his gaze to the inscription, then slowly turned toward the faces gathered before him. Near the podium stood Angela, tears glinting in her eyes, her expression full of unspoken pride and deep, abiding love. In the front row, the soldiers who'd helped save him that night stood tall in their uniforms, backs straight, eyes locked on their commander. And behind them, stretching row after row, were veterans from every branch, every war, every background. They had come to witness this, to honor not just Hal, but the cause his suffering had advanced. It was more than a ceremony. It was a testament to what could happen when a nation decided to right a wrong. Hal looked out at the sea of faces. The wind whispered through the flags, and then with deliberate calm he began. "When I came here a year ago," he said, his voice firm, his words clear in the still morning air, "I didn't expect to leave." He was still standing, alive. And if he was being honest, it hadn't been the systems or the policies that saved his life. It had been people, individuals who still held tight to the meaning of loyalty, people who believed that no one, absolutely no one, should ever be left behind. Not on the battlefield, and not when they came home. He paused, giving the silence time to soak up the weight of his words. Then he looked out over the gathered crowd and continued. "This building, this wing, it isn't about me. It's about duty, the duty we all share as Americans, to protect and uplift those who stepped forward when their country called on them." His voice didn't rise, but it carried. This place stands as a promise that no veteran, no family, will ever again have to wonder if help will come in time. Let it be a promise we keep. A wave of applause broke out, loud and long, but Hal didn't bask in it. He simply bowed his head, quiet and humbled, letting the moment wash over him. The rest of the ceremony went on, speeches given by suited officials, ribbons cut with oversized scissors, cameras flashing from every angle. But for Hal, the true significance wasn't tied up in ceremony. The true legacy wasn't brick and steel. It was something deeper, a shift in perspective, a renewed sense of obligation. It was the moment a country's conscience stirred awake. As the crowd gradually began to thin, Hal turned back toward the new wing once more. He let his eyes rest on the building, sturdy and solemn. The storm he had endured had tested everything in him, his will, his spirit, his belief in the system. But in the aftermath of that test, he saw something emerge. America rediscovering its duty. A duty that must never again be lost to time or bureaucracy or apathy. When we look back on Colonel Hal Carter's journey, What we see isn't just a military story, it's a mirror held up to our society. We're reminded that duty, honor, and compassion are not reserved for soldiers alone. They're not just engraved on medals or whispered in ceremonies. They are the principles that should guide how we live, how we lead, how we care for one another. Because what happened to Hal didn't end with him. It continues, reflected in every veteran who waits too long for help, in every family who doesn't get answers, in every system that falls short. It makes us question, how many more Hal Carters are out there, unseen, unheard, unhelped? It shows us the danger of assumptions made too quickly, judgments passed without knowing the story. It reveals the cracks in systems designed to help, but too often failing those they were built to serve. And most of all, it reminds us that we, as citizens, as neighbors, must be the ones who refuse to look away. In today's frantic world, where everything moves fast and attention is fleeting, it's far too easy to forget the quiet sacrifices. Those made not just by veterans, but by everyday people around us. Hal's journey is a call to slow down, to truly see the person standing in front of us, to speak up, to step forward, to act when injustice shows its face, whether it's in a hospital hallway, a waiting room, or just across the street. And yet, Hal's story doesn't just give us answers. It leaves us with questions that matter. What more can we do to ensure that no veteran is ever forgotten, ever again? How do we challenge and hold institutions accountable without giving up on them? And perhaps the most personal of all, how do we, as individuals, carry this sense of duty forward to protect and honor those who've worn the uniform and to live by the values we so often take for granted? We want to hear your voice. Have you seen or gone through something like this? What has Hal's story stirred in you? What lesson will you carry into your own life? Share your thoughts below, because your story, your voice, it matters. And together we can keep this conversation alive and growing. Thank you for spending these few moments with us. Thank you for honoring Hal Carter's legacy by listening, by truly listening. If this story moved you, please consider clicking the like button, sharing it with someone who might need to hear it today, and subscribing to our channel for more powerful true stories. Stories that remind us of the strength, the heart, and the shared spirit that binds us as Americans. Until next time, stay safe, stay kind, and take care of each other.